managed menstruation. Before recorded history, before cities, before writing systems and organized medicine, human life was shaped entirely by survival. In that world, menstruation was not understood as a biological process the way it is today. It was experienced simply as something that happened, regularly, naturally, and often unpredictably, within the challenges of harsh environments, shifting climates, and constant movement. To understand how ancient women managed menstruation, we must first understand the world they lived in. Early humans did not have permanent shelters in many regions. They moved with seasons, followed animals, and depended on gathering edible plants, hunting, and adapting to whatever nature provided. In such a lifestyle, even basic hygiene was a complex issue. Water sources were not always nearby. Clean, soft materials were not stored in abundance, and privacy itself was limited. Yet menstruation still occurred, just as it does today, because it is a fundamental part of the human reproductive cycle. For early women, this biological reality had to be managed through instinct, observation, adaptation, and the resources immediately available in their environment. There are no written records from prehistoric women themselves, but archaeology, anthropology, and studies of modern indigenous communities give us clues about how menstruation may have been handled in early human societies. These clues suggest a combination of natural materials, behavioral adaptation, and social patterns that evolved slowly over thousands of years. In the earliest phases of human existence, one of the most likely methods of menstrual management was the use of natural absorbent materials. Soft leaves, moss, animal fur, and tree bark fibers could be shaped and placed against the body to absorb blood flow. These materials were not products in any modern sense. They were simply part of the environment, selected for softness, availability, and absorbent qualities. In forested regions, moss would have been especially useful. Moss naturally retains moisture and is soft against the skin. It can be gathered easily and replaced frequently. Similarly, grass bundles or folded leaves could serve as temporary absorbents. In colder regions, animal fur or wool-like fibers from hunted animals might have been used, offering warmth as well as absorption. But materials alone were not enough. The way early humans behaved during menstruation also mattered. Movement patterns may have changed slightly. Women experiencing menstrual flow may have preferred to stay closer to water sources when possible, allowing for more frequent cleaning. Washing with water would have been one of the earliest and most important forms of hygiene. Even without soap, water itself plays a powerful role in cleansing. It is also likely that early humans developed an intuitive understanding of isolation during menstruation, not necessarily as a taboo at first, but as a practical response. In a survival-based environment, reducing physical strain during days of discomfort or fatigue would have been beneficial. This could have led to temporary separation during menstruation in some groups, though not necessarily in a negative or restrictive sense in the earlier stages. Over time, as human societies began to form more stable groups and develop early cultural beliefs, menstruation began to take on symbolic meaning. In some early communities, the visible presence of blood, especially without obvious injury, may have been interpreted in spiritual or mystical terms. This is where the transition from purely practical management to cultural interpretation begins. However, it is important not to assume that early societies universally viewed menstruation as negative. Anthropological studies of certain hunter-gatherer societies suggest that menstruation may have been seen as a natural sign of fertility and life continuity. In such interpretations, menstruating women were not necessarily unclean, but instead connected to natural cycles of reproduction, much like lunar phases, seasonal changes, and animal migrations. In these early belief systems, menstruation may have been associated with the moon. The lunar cycle and the menstrual cycle are closely aligned in duration, and it is likely that early humans noticed this pattern. Without scientific explanation, the regular timing of both cycles could have led to symbolic connections. The moon represented change, rhythm, and renewal, qualities that could easily be extended to human biology. As tools became more advanced, early humans also improved their clothing. The use of stitched animal hides, woven plant fibers, and layered coverings allowed for better protection and concealment. These developments gradually improved menstrual management, making it easier to contain flow and maintain cleanliness during daily activities. It is also possible that early women used repetitive washing practices during menstruation whenever water was accessible. Rivers, lakes, and streams were central to human survival, and bathing would have been a natural part of life. During menstrual periods, increased washing may have been both practical and comforting, even without formal hygiene concepts. Still, life was not easy. Without standardized materials, menstrual management would have varied greatly depending on geography, climate, and available resources. In dry regions where water was scarce, women likely relied more on absorbent plant materials and careful movement. In humid or forested regions, frequent washing and replacement of natural materials may have been more common. Another important aspect to consider is the role of fire. Fire provided warmth, protection, and a way to process materials. It is possible that early humans used fire-dried plant fibers or softened materials to create more comfortable absorbents. Fire also enabled social gathering at night, which may have influenced shared knowledge about bodily cycles, even if that knowledge was not formally recorded. As human cognition evolved, so did the ability to communicate about bodily experiences. Early language likely included basic descriptions of bodily states, including bleeding cycles. This communication would have allowed older women to pass knowledge to younger girls about how to manage menstruation using available materials. This oral tradition would become one of the most important survival tools in human history. In this earliest stage of human existence, menstruation was not a separate topic of study or taboo. It was part of life, managed quietly, practically, and often collectively within small groups. The focus was not on ideology, but on survival, comfort, and adaptation. As humanity moved closer to agricultural settlements and the rise of civilizations, menstruation would begin to take on new meanings: medical, religious, and social. But in the beginning, it was simply a natural biological rhythm, managed with the intelligence of observation and the resources of the earth. This is where the story begins, not in temples or cities, but in forests, riversides, and open landscapes where early women lived, survived, and adapted with remarkable resilience. And from here, human history begins to reshape how this natural process is understood, recorded, and eventually transformed by culture and civilization. Ancient Egypt and the Nile civilization. Menstruation in the first recorded medical culture. As human societies moved from nomadic survival into settled agricultural civilizations, everything about daily life began to change. One of the earliest and most influential civilizations in this transformation was ancient Egypt. Along the fertile banks of the Nile River, human life became more organized, more structured, and for the first time in history, more systematically recorded. This is where menstruation begins to appear, not just as a lived experience, but as something interpreted through early medicine, religion, and written documentation. Ancient Egypt is especially important in understanding menstrual management because it left behind medical papyri, written records that describe diseases, treatments, bodily functions, and hygiene practices. While these texts do not always describe menstruation in modern scientific terms, they provide valuable insight into how the human body was understood more than 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. In Egyptian society, women played essential roles in household management, agriculture, textile production, and religious life. Their health and bodily cycles were therefore not ignored, even if they were sometimes interpreted through spiritual or symbolic frameworks. One of the most important aspects of menstrual management in ancient Egypt was the availability of linen. Linen, made from flax plants, was one of the most widely used textiles in Egyptian life. It was soft, breathable, and relatively easy to clean compared to animal hides or rough plant fibers used in earlier societies. This made it one of the earliest known materials suitable for reusable absorbent cloth. It is widely believed that Egyptian women used strips or folded pieces of linen as an early form of menstrual cloth. These were not disposable products in the modern sense, but reusable fabric pieces that could be washed in the Nile, dried in the sun, and used again. The dry climate of Egypt also helped with hygiene, as sunlight naturally reduced bacterial growth on washed fabrics. Water from the Nile River was central to Egyptian life, and bathing or washing garments was a normal part of daily routine. This accessibility to water allowed for more regular cleaning during menstruation compared to many earlier or more arid regions. Women could maintain hygiene by rinsing cloth materials frequently, which improved comfort and reduced health risks. Ancient Egyptian medical understanding of the body was deeply connected to concepts of balance and flow. The human body was seen as a system of channels through which fluids moved. Health was thought to depend on the proper balance of these flows. Within this framework, menstrual blood was likely understood as one of the natural bodily fluids that needed to be released periodically to maintain balance. Medical papyri, such as the Ebers papyrus and Kahan gynecological papyrus, contain references to women's health, fertility, and reproductive conditions. While they do not always describe menstruation in explicit modern terms, they show that Egyptian physicians were aware of female reproductive cycles and attempted to treat related symptoms using herbal remedies. physical treatments, and magical religious rituals. In some cases, menstrual-related conditions may have been treated with plant-based medicines. The Egyptians had extensive knowledge of herbs and natural substances. Ingredients such as honey, acacia, frankincense, and castor oil were commonly used in medical treatments. These substances were believed to have cleansing, protective, or restorative properties. Religious interpretation also played a role. Egyptian society did not separate medicine and spirituality as modern science does. Healing often involved both physical treatment and spiritual protection. It is possible that menstruation was sometimes associated with fertility goddesses, such as Isis, who represented motherhood, healing, and life-giving power. In this context, menstruation may have been seen not as impurity, but as part of the sacred reproductive cycle. However, like many ancient civilizations, social attitudes toward menstrual blood were complex. While it was a natural process, it was also associated with bodily fluids that required cleanliness. This does not necessarily mean stigma in the modern sense, but rather a practical concern for hygiene and ritual purity in certain religious contexts. Daily life for Egyptian women likely included practical strategies for managing menstruation while continuing normal responsibilities. Women worked in textile production, household management, and sometimes even in agriculture and trade. This means menstrual management had to be functional and reliable. Linen cloths, washing routines, and careful planning would have allowed women to continue participating in daily life with minimal disruption. Archaeological evidence from Egyptian tomb paintings and household artifacts does not directly depict menstrual practices, but it does show the importance of hygiene, bathing, and clothing care. Washing linen garments in water, drying them in sunlight, and maintaining personal cleanliness were clearly established parts of life. Another important aspect of Egyptian menstrual management is privacy and space. Wealthier households may have had more private bathing areas or enclosed spaces where women could manage bodily needs more comfortably. In contrast, poorer households likely relied on shared spaces near the river or communal washing areas. The Nile itself played a symbolic and practical role. As the source of life for Egyptian civilization, it was deeply connected to ideas of renewal, fertility, and continuity. It is not difficult to imagine that the natural cycles of the river, its annual flooding and retreat, may have been symbolically associated with human reproductive cycles, including menstruation. Over time, Egyptian understanding of the body influenced later civilizations, especially Greek and Roman medical traditions. The combination of practical hygiene methods, like linen cloth and washing routines, and early medical theories, formed one of the earliest structured approaches to women's health in human history. In summary, ancient Egypt represents a major step forward in menstrual management. For the first time, we see a civilization where reusable textile systems, linen cloths were likely used. Regular washing with abundant water was possible. Medical texts referenced women's reproductive health. Hygiene and spirituality were combined in treatment. Daily life allowed structured management of menstrual cycles. It was not modern medicine, but it was organized, adaptive, and deeply connected to both environment and culture. And from the Nile Valley, these ideas would slowly travel outward into Mesopotamia, Greece, and beyond, where menstruation would continue to be reinterpreted through new philosophies, beliefs, and medical systems. Mesopotamia and the first cities of menstruation in early urban civilization. As human civilization expanded beyond the Nile Valley, another powerful center of early development emerged between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Mesopotamia. Often called the cradle of civilization, this region gave rise to the first cities, the first written language cuneiform, organized law codes, and structured religious systems. With this shift from small communities and river-based settlements to complex urban societies, the way human bodies were understood also began to change. Menstruation, once managed purely through practical survival methods, now entered a world of formal beliefs, early medicine, social structure, and symbolic interpretation. In Mesopotamia, daily life was more structured than in earlier societies. Cities like Ur, Uruk, and Babylon had temples, administrative systems, markets, and craft industries. This urban environment created both advantages and challenges for menstrual management. On one hand, there was better access to woven textiles and organized households. On the other hand, crowded living conditions and limited sanitation systems made hygiene more complicated. One of the most important developments in Mesopotamian society was textile production. Wool and flax were widely used, and weaving was a major industry controlled by both households and temples. Women often participated in textile work, and woven cloth would have been available for use as absorbent material during menstruation. Like in Egypt, reusable cloth pieces were likely the primary method of menstrual management. However, unlike the relatively dry and predictable Nile environment, Mesopotamia had more variable climate conditions and less consistent access to clean running water in urban settings. This meant that washing menstrual cloths may have been more challenging, requiring careful water use from wells, canals, or communal water sources. In addition to practical concerns, Mesopotamian society developed some of the earliest recorded medical and magical interpretations of the human body. The Mesopotamians believed that illness and bodily conditions could be caused by both physical imbalance and supernatural forces, such as angry gods, spirits, or demons. As a result, health practices often combined herbal medicine with ritual and incantation. Menstruation, as a visible and recurring bodily process involving blood, naturally became part of this broader worldview. In some contexts, menstrual blood may have been seen as a powerful substance connected to fertility, life cycles, and spiritual forces. In others, it may have been associated with ritual impurity in specific religious or ceremonial settings. Cuneiform tablets, which recorded everything from trade transactions to medical recipes, include references to women's health and reproductive conditions. Mesopotamian medical texts often describe treatments for female ailments, fertility issues, and childbirth-related complications. While not always explicitly focused on menstruation itself, these texts show that female reproductive health was a recognized area of knowledge. Herbal remedies were commonly used. Plants such as myrrh, juniper, dates, and various oils were applied in treatments believed to balance the body or protect against illness. These treatments were often combined with spoken prayers or rituals performed by healers, priests, or temple practitioners. Social structure also played a role in how menstruation was experienced. In urban Mesopotamia, households were typically organized around extended families. Women's roles included domestic work, textile production, food preparation, and sometimes participation in temple economies. Because of this, menstruation had to be managed in a way that allowed continuity of daily responsibilities. Privacy in Mesopotamian cities was limited compared to earlier rural lifestyles. Houses were built close together, and sanitation systems were basic. Waste removal and water drainage existed, but were not highly advanced. In this environment, menstrual hygiene required practical adaptation, careful washing routines, reuse of cloth materials, and possibly temporary rest during heavier flow days when possible. Religious beliefs also influenced attitudes toward bodily fluids. Mesopotamian religion was complex, involving a large pantheon of gods and strict ritual practices. In some religious contexts, bodily emissions such as blood, semen, or other fluids could be associated with ritual impurity. This does not necessarily mean menstruation was universally stigmatized, but it may have required certain cleanliness practices before participating in temple activities or sacred spaces. At the same time, fertility was highly valued in Mesopotamian society. Agriculture depended on seasonal cycles, irrigation, and reproduction of both crops and livestock. As a result, women's reproductive ability was central to social and economic stability. Menstruation, as a visible sign of reproductive functioning, may have been understood as part of this larger cycle of fertility and renewal. Mythology also offers insight into cultural thinking. In Mesopotamian myth, goddesses such as Inanna Ishtar represent fertility, love, war, and cyclical transformation. While menstruation is not always directly referenced in mythological texts, the broader symbolic association between feminine power, cycles, and life-death rebirth themes is clear. Blood, in many ancient cultures, carried both life-giving and dangerous symbolic meanings. One important aspect of Mesopotamian life was the early development of law codes, such as the Code of Hammurabi. While these laws do not directly regulate menstruation, they reflect a society highly concerned with order, behavior, and social roles. Within such a structured system, bodily states like menstruation may have influenced rules around participation in religious rituals or certain public activities, especially those requiring ritual purity. Despite the complexity of beliefs and urban challenges, women in Mesopotamia would have continued to rely on practical menstrual management techniques. These likely included reusable woven cloth pads made from wool or linen, washing in available water sources, such as canals or wells, changing cloths regularly to maintain hygiene, adjusting physical activity during discomfort when possible. The key difference from earlier societies was not just the method, but the context. Menstruation now existed within a structured city life, influenced by religion, law, medicine, and social hierarchy. Mesopotamia represents a turning point where menstruation becomes part of recorded human knowledge systems. It is no longer only an instinctive survival process. It is something interpreted, documented, and integrated into early medical and spiritual frameworks. From here, these ideas would continue to evolve as they spread into neighboring regions, especially into the Indian subcontinent, where entirely new systems of medicine and philosophy would shape how menstruation was understood for thousands of years. Ancient India and Ayurvedic understanding. Menstruation as cycle, balance, and natural rhythm. As human civilization expanded across continents, the Indian subcontinent developed one of the most sophisticated and long-lasting systems of traditional knowledge, Ayurveda. Unlike purely mythological or purely practical approaches seen in earlier societies, ancient Indian thought combined observation, philosophy, medicine, and spirituality into a single framework for understanding the human body. Within this system, menstruation was not viewed as an isolated or abnormal event. Instead, it was understood as a natural biological rhythm connected to fertility, bodily balance, and the broader cycles of nature. In ancient India, life was deeply influenced by seasonal changes, agricultural cycles, and the rhythms of the natural world. This environmental awareness shaped how the human body was interpreted. The body was seen as a microcosm of nature itself, governed by internal energies and external influences. Ayurveda describes the body through the concept of doshas, vata, pitta, and kapha. These represent functional principles governing movement, transformation, and structure. Health, in Ayurvedic understanding, depends on the balance of these forces. Menstruation was interpreted as part of the body's natural cleansing and renewal process, particularly related to reproductive tissues and hormonal balance described in ancient terms as bodily essences and fluids. Menstrual blood was considered a natural monthly discharge linked to fertility and the reproductive system's functioning. It was not inherently seen as impurity in a medical sense, though cultural and ritual practices sometimes place guidelines around behavior during menstruation for reasons of rest, hygiene, and energy conservation. One of the most important aspects of menstrual management in ancient India was the widespread use of cloth. Women commonly used cotton or woven fabric, folded into layers as absorbent material. India's textile tradition was highly advanced even in ancient times, with cotton cultivation and weaving techniques, producing soft, breathable fabrics ideal for reuse. These cloths were typically washed and reused, often cleaned with water and sometimes natural cleansing agents like ash or herbal infusions. Sun drying played an important role, as sunlight was believed to purify and restore cleanliness, in addition to its practical antimicrobial effect. Access to rivers such as the Ganges, Yamuna, and Godavari also played a significant role in hygiene practices. Bathing in rivers was a common cultural and religious practice, and water was central to both physical cleanliness and spiritual purification. During menstruation, women would adjust their routines based on comfort, availability of privacy, and social norms within their communities. Ancient Indian texts, including later Ayurvedic compilations like the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita, discuss aspects of female reproductive health. While menstruation is not always described in modern physiological terms, these texts clearly show awareness of menstrual cycles, fertility timing, and related health conditions. Medical practitioners of Ayurveda emphasize diet, rest, and lifestyle balance during menstruation. Women were often encouraged to avoid excessive physical exertion during heavy flow days, and to maintain simple, easily digestible foods that supported bodily balance. This approach reflects the broader Ayurvedic principle that health is maintained through harmony between body, mind, and environment. At the same time, cultural practices surrounding menstruation varied across regions and communities. In some traditions, menstruation was treated as a time for rest and reduced participation in certain ritual activities. This was not necessarily rooted in negativity, but in the idea that the body was undergoing a natural internal process, requiring energy conservation and minimal external disturbance. In rural and urban settings alike, menstrual management remained practical at its core. Cloth was the primary absorbent material, and its effectiveness depended on careful washing, drying, and reuse. Women developed routines that fit into daily life, balancing household responsibilities, work, and personal care. Indian society was also deeply diverse, and attitudes toward menstruation were not uniform across all regions, castes, or communities. Some groups emphasized ritual restrictions, while others focused more on practical hygiene and medical understanding. This diversity reflects the complexity of ancient Indian civilization itself, which was never a single unified system, but a collection of overlapping traditions and philosophies. Mythology and symbolism also influenced cultural perceptions. In Hindu tradition, feminine energy Shakti is central to creation and cosmic balance. Goddesses are often associated with fertility, power, and transformation. Within this symbolic framework, menstruation could be interpreted in multiple ways, both as a natural biological function and as part of larger cosmic cycles of creation and renewal. Importantly, ancient Indian understanding did not separate physical health from mental and spiritual well-being. Emotional state, diet, environment, and lifestyle were all considered interconnected. Menstruation was therefore managed not only through physical means, but also through behavioral and environmental adjustments aimed at maintaining overall harmony. In terms of hygiene, the combination of cotton textiles, water access, and sun drying created a relatively advanced system for menstrual management compared to many earlier civilizations. Although still far from modern sanitary products, these methods were effective, sustainable, and deeply integrated into daily life. Over time, Ayurvedic principles influenced neighboring regions and later medical traditions. The emphasis on natural cycles, bodily balance, and holistic health contributed to a long-lasting framework that continued to shape menstrual understanding in South Asia for centuries. In summary, ancient India represents a stage where menstruation was understood through a multi-layered lens. Biological function within reproductive health, natural cleansing cycle in Ayurvedic theory, practical management using cotton cloth and water, cultural and ritual practices varying by region, philosophical connection to cosmic and natural cycles. This combination of medicine, culture, and philosophy created one of the most comprehensive early systems for understanding menstruation in human history. From here, the story moves eastward into another major tradition, ancient China, where medical theory, yin-yang balance, and herbal science shaped yet another unique interpretation of the female body and its cycles. Ancient China and traditional medicine views menstruation, qi, and the balance of yin and yang. As human civilizations developed independently across Asia, another highly sophisticated system of medicine and philosophy emerged in ancient China. Like Ayurveda in India, traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, did not separate the body from nature. Instead, it viewed human health as part of a larger cosmic order governed by balance, flow, and harmony. Within this framework, menstruation was understood not as a single isolated biological event, but as part of the body's continuous circulation of energy and blood, closely tied to fertility, seasonal rhythms, and internal balance. At the center of ancient Chinese medical theory is the concept of qi, often translated as vital energy or life force. Qi flows through the body along pathways known as meridians. Health depends on the smooth, balanced flow of qi, while illness arises when it becomes blocked, weak, or excessive. Alongside qi, blood is considered a vital substance that nourishes the body and supports life. Menstruation in this system is closely linked to the movement of blood and the functioning of the liver, spleen, and kidney systems as described in classical texts. It is not viewed as waste in a negative sense, but rather as part of a regulated cycle of blood movement and renewal within the female body. One of the foundational philosophical ideas in Chinese thought is the principle of yin and yang. Yin represents qualities such as darkness, coolness, rest, and nourishment, while yang represents activity, heat, movement, and energy. The balance between these two forces is essential for health and harmony. In traditional Chinese medical interpretation, menstruation is often associated with yin aspects of the body, particularly because it involves internal processes, blood storage, and cyclical release. A healthy menstrual cycle was understood as a sign that yin and yang were in proper balance, allowing blood to be stored, nourished, and released in a regulated rhythm each month. Ancient Chinese medical texts, including foundational works such as the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, provide insight into early understanding of women's health. These texts describe reproductive cycles, fertility timing, and bodily patterns that reflect an awareness of menstruation as part of a larger physiological system. In practical life, menstrual management in ancient China relied heavily on textile use. Similar to other early civilizations, women used folded cloth made from silk, hemp, or cotton, depending on region and social class. Silk, in particular, was a highly valued material in Chinese society, known for its smooth texture and durability. For those who could afford it, silk cloth would have provided a comfortable and reusable option for managing menstrual flow. These cloths were washed and reused, typically with water and sometimes with herbal rinses. Hygiene practices were closely linked to broader ideas of cleanliness and balance. Maintaining physical cleanliness was seen not only as practical, but also as important for preserving internal harmony and preventing stagnation of qi and blood. Water sources such as wells, rivers, and household basins were used for washing. In rural areas, access to private bathing spaces may have been limited, but washing routines were still maintained as part of daily life. Sun-drying fabrics was common, as sunlight was believed to carry purifying qualities in addition to its practical drying function. Chinese medicine also placed strong emphasis on diet and lifestyle during menstruation. Foods were chosen based on their perceived warming or cooling properties, their effect on blood circulation, and their ability to support energy levels. Warm soups, grains, and easily digestible foods were often recommended to maintain balance during menstrual periods, especially if a woman experienced fatigue or discomfort. Herbal medicine played a significant role as well. Traditional Chinese pharmacology included hundreds of plant-based substances used to support blood circulation, relieve pain, and regulate menstrual cycles. Herbs such as angelica root dong quai, ginger, cinnamon, and peony were commonly associated with women's health and reproductive balance. In many cases, menstruation was seen as an indicator of overall health. Irregular cycles, pain, or excessive bleeding were interpreted as signs of imbalance in qi, blood deficiency, or disruptions in organ systems. Treatment therefore focused not only on symptoms, but on restoring systemic harmony. Social attitudes toward menstruation in ancient China were shaped by both practical concerns and cultural norms. While menstruation was a natural biological process, it was also associated with internal bodily states that required care and attention. As a result, women might reduce participation in certain physical activities or rituals during menstruation, not necessarily due to stigma, but due to ideas of bodily energy, conservation, and balance. Confucian cultural influence, which emphasized order, family roles, and social harmony, also shaped women's daily life. Within household structures, women's health and reproductive cycles were closely tied to expectations around marriage, fertility, and family continuity. Menstruation, as a visible sign of fertility, was therefore indirectly linked to broader social responsibilities. At the same time, Taoist philosophy offered a more naturalistic perspective, emphasizing alignment with nature, spontaneity, and internal balance. In Taoist thought, bodily processes such as menstruation were seen as natural expressions of the body's alignment with cosmic rhythms. This perspective often encouraged simplicity, rest, and harmony with natural cycles. Across both medical and philosophical traditions, there was a consistent theme. The body was not separate from nature, and menstruation was not an abnormal disruption, but a regular, meaningful cycle within a larger system of balance. In everyday life, women in ancient China managed menstruation through practical routines that reflected these beliefs. Cloth materials were carefully maintained, washing practices were regular, and attention was given to diet, rest, and emotional balance. Although material conditions varied across social classes, the underlying principle of cyclical harmony remained central. In summary, ancient Chinese understanding of menstruation can be described through several key ideas. Menstruation as part of blood and qi circulation. Health defined by yin-yang balance. Herbal medicine supporting reproductive regulation. Cloth-based menstrual management. Silk, hemp, cotton diet, and lifestyle adjustments for internal harmony. Integration of medical, philosophical, and cultural systems. This holistic worldview created a deeply interconnected understanding of the female body, one that emphasized rhythm, balance, and continuity rather than separation or isolation. From China, the historical journey of menstrual understanding continues westward again into the classical world of Greece and Rome, where medical philosophy takes a more anatomical and observational turn, shaping Western medical thought for centuries to come. Ancient Greece and Rome. Menstruation, early anatomy, and classical medical thought. As human civilization entered the classical period in the Mediterranean world, the understanding of the body began to shift again. In ancient Greece and later in Rome, thinkers started to move away from purely mythological explanations of health and toward observation, classification, and early forms of medical reasoning. This transition created a new way of interpreting menstruation, one that combined philosophy, early anatomy, humor theory, and social ideas about the female body. In ancient Greece, medicine was heavily influenced by the Hippocratic tradition. The Hippocratic corpus, a collection of medical writings attributed to Hippocrates and his followers, represents one of the earliest attempts to systematically study the human body, based on observation rather than divine explanation. Within this framework, menstruation was considered a natural and essential process for female health. Greek physicians believed that women's bodies contained excess fluids that needed to be regularly expelled to maintain balance. Menstrual blood was understood as part of this natural purification system. A key idea in Greek medicine was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on the balance of these fluids. Menstruation was often interpreted as a way for the female body to regulate blood levels and maintain internal equilibrium. If menstruation was irregular or absent, it was thought to indicate an imbalance that could lead to illness. This medical interpretation shaped how menstruation was treated in practice. Physicians might recommend lifestyle changes, dietary adjustments, or herbal remedies to restore regular cycles. Foods, physical activity, and emotional state were all considered factors influencing menstrual health. In daily life, Greek women managed menstruation using simple but effective textile-based methods. Woven cloth, often made from linen or wool depending on region and class, was folded and used as an absorbent material. These cloths were washed and reused. Similar to practices in Egypt and other ancient civilizations. Access to water varied depending on location. In city-states like Athens, public fountains and household water systems provided basic access, but privacy could be limited. In rural areas, rivers and natural water sources were more commonly used for washing and hygiene. Greek society was highly structured around gender roles. Women were generally responsible for domestic work, child-rearing, and household management, while public life was dominated by men. Because of this separation, Menstruation was largely a private matter managed within the household. It was not widely discussed in public discourse, but it was recognized as a normal aspect of female biology. Religious and cultural beliefs in Greece were diverse. While menstruation was not universally viewed as negative, bodily fluids in general were sometimes associated with ritual purity requirements, especially in temple contexts. Certain religious practices may have required temporary avoidance of sacred spaces during menstruation, though interpretations varied across regions and cults. Greek mythology also provides indirect insight into how female biology was understood symbolically. Goddesses such as Hera, Artemis, and Demeter were associated with marriage, fertility, childbirth, and natural cycles. While menstruation is not explicitly detailed in mythological stories, the broader symbolic framework of female life stages and fertility was clearly important in Greek culture. As Greek medical thought developed further, figures like Aristotle contributed additional biological theories. Aristotle's writings on reproduction described menstruation as part of the female contribution to reproduction, based on his belief that males provided form and females provided matter. Although scientifically inaccurate by modern standards, this theory reflects an early attempt to explain reproductive biology through observation and philosophy. When Roman civilization rose and expanded across Europe and the Mediterranean, it inherited much of Greek medical knowledge, but adapted it into its own highly organized society. Roman medicine was practical, administrative, and focused on public health, as well as individual treatment. Roman physicians such as Galen further developed the theory of humors and anatomical observation. Galenic medicine dominated European medical thinking for more than 1,000 years. Within this system, menstruation continued to be understood as a natural bodily function necessary for maintaining balance in female health. In Roman daily life, menstrual management was practical and similar to earlier Mediterranean cultures. Women used cloth materials as absorbents, typically made from linen or other woven fabrics. These were cleaned and reused, with washing done in household water systems, baths, or public fountains where appropriate. The Roman Empire had a relatively advanced infrastructure for its time, including aqueducts, baths, and sanitation systems. Public baths were a central part of Roman culture, although privacy and social norms meant that menstrual hygiene was still primarily managed in private household settings. Roman attitudes towards menstruation combined practicality with cultural beliefs. While menstruation was recognized as normal, there were also superstitions and symbolic ideas surrounding female bodily fluids. Some Roman writers recorded beliefs about menstrual blood having unusual properties, reflecting broader ancient tendencies to attribute both medical and mystical significance to bodily substances. At the same time, Roman society placed strong emphasis on family structure, reproduction, and lineage. Women's reproductive health was therefore important in maintaining household continuity and inheritance systems. Menstruation, as a sign of fertility and reproductive function, was indirectly connected to social stability. Medical treatments for menstrual irregularities in Roman times often involved herbal remedies, dietary regulation, and physical exercise. Plants such as fennel, dill, and various medicinal herbs were commonly used in treatments, aimed at regulating the menstrual cycle or relieving discomfort. Across both Greece and Rome, a clear pattern emerges. Menstruation was understood through a combination of observation, early scientific reasoning, and cultural interpretation. It was not yet understood in modern biological terms, but it was increasingly recognized as a consistent physiological process rather than something mysterious or supernatural. In summary, ancient Greece and Rome contributed several key developments to the understanding of menstruation. Medical theories based on observation and early anatomy. The humor system linking menstruation to bodily balance. Practical textile-based menstrual management. Household-based hygiene routines using water systems. Cultural and philosophical interpretations of female biology. Integration of menstruation into broader medical theory. This classical foundation would go on to shape European medical thought for centuries, influencing how menstruation was understood well into the medieval period. From here, the story moves beyond the Mediterranean world into the diverse indigenous cultures across Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific, where entirely different environmental and cultural adaptations shaped menstrual practices in unique and fascinating ways. Indigenous cultures around the world. Natural materials, community practices, and living with cycles. As human populations spread across continents, not all societies followed the same path of urbanization or written record keeping. Many indigenous cultures around the world continue to live in close relationship with nature, relying on seasonal cycles, ecological knowledge, and community-based living systems. In these environments, menstruation was managed in ways that were deeply shaped by geography, climate, available materials, and cultural meaning. Unlike the centralized medical systems of Egypt, India, China, Greece, or Rome, indigenous approaches to menstruation were highly diverse. There was no single worldview. Instead, there were thousands of localized traditions, each adapted to forests, deserts, mountains, islands, plains, or Arctic environments. What connects many of these traditions is a shared reliance on natural materials, practical hygiene strategies, and strong cultural interpretations of the menstrual cycle as part of life's natural rhythm. In forested regions, such as parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Americas, women often used plant-based materials for menstrual management. Soft leaves, moss, tree bark fibers, and grasses could be shaped into absorbent layers. These materials were chosen based on softness, absorbency, and availability, and were often replaced frequently to maintain cleanliness. In colder climates, particularly in northern regions, animal-derived materials played a more important role. Fur, wool, and soft animal hides provided warmth as well as absorption. In some Arctic and subarctic communities, where survival depended heavily on animal resources, nearly every part of an animal had a functional purpose, and menstrual materials were no exception. Water access also influenced hygiene practices. In river-based communities, washing was easier and more frequent. In dry or frozen environments, water conservation meant that cleaning routines had to be carefully managed, sometimes relying on melted snow or limited seasonal water sources. Despite these challenges, indigenous knowledge systems developed highly effective ways of maintaining cleanliness under difficult conditions. In many indigenous societies, menstruation was not only a physical process, but also a socially recognized stage of life. Some communities viewed it as a transition into womanhood, marking a shift in social responsibilities, identity, or eligibility for marriage and family roles. In these cases, menstruation carried cultural meaning tied to maturity and life stages. However, interpretations varied widely. In some traditions, menstruation was seen as a powerful, sacred process connected to fertility and life creation. In others, it was treated as a private or restricted time, where women might temporarily step away from certain communal or ritual activities. These practices were not uniform across all cultures and should not be generalized as universal rules. In parts of indigenous Africa, menstrual practices were often closely connected to community life and oral knowledge systems. Elders played an important role in teaching younger girls how to manage menstruation using available materials and established routines. Knowledge was passed through generations without written texts, relying instead on storytelling, demonstration, and lived experience. In many indigenous American cultures, natural fibers and plant-based materials were commonly used. Women often had extensive knowledge of local plants, including which leaves were soft, which mosses retained moisture effectively, and which natural materials were safest for skin contact. This ecological knowledge was part of broader survival skills that included medicine, food gathering, and environmental navigation. In some Pacific Island cultures, ocean environments influenced hygiene practices. Water was abundant, but materials for absorbance had to be adapted from plant fibers such as pandanus leaves or woven natural cloth. The ocean itself also held cultural and spiritual significance, often associated with life cycles, renewal, and cleansing. Across many indigenous societies, clothing itself sometimes served dual purposes. Wrap garments, skirts, or layered textiles could function as both everyday clothing and menstrual protection. This reflects a flexible, adaptive approach, where materials were not specialized industrial products, but multi-purpose elements of daily life. Spiritual interpretations of menstruation also varied widely. In some traditions, menstruation was associated with life force, fertility, or connection to ancestral cycles. In others, it was considered a time for rest, reflection, or reduced physical activity. These practices were often based on community norms rather than formalized medical systems. Importantly, indigenous knowledge systems tended to emphasize harmony with the environment rather than separation from it. Menstruation was understood as part of the same natural world that included seasons, animal migrations, plant growth, and lunar cycles. This ecological perspective created a sense of continuity between human biology and the surrounding ecosystem. At the same time, practical survival remained central. Whether in rainforests, deserts, mountains, or tundra, menstrual management had to be functional. The key requirements were always the same: absorbency, cleanliness, comfort, and availability. The solutions, however, were infinitely diverse. Another important aspect of indigenous menstrual management was community support. In many societies, women shared knowledge about bodily cycles openly within female spaces. Older women often guided younger girls through their first menstrual experiences, teaching them how to use materials, maintain hygiene, and understand bodily changes. These systems were not uniform across all cultures, but they highlight an important reality. Menstruation was not always an isolated or purely private experience. In many indigenous contexts, it was part of a shared social learning process. Over time, contact with expanding empires, trade networks, and colonial systems would significantly alter many of these indigenous practices. Some traditional knowledge was preserved, while other practices were lost, suppressed, or transformed under new cultural pressures. Despite this, many indigenous menstrual practices continue to influence modern understandings of natural, sustainable, and environmentally adapted hygiene methods. In summary, indigenous cultures around the world demonstrate extensive use of natural materials, plants, moss, animal fibers, strong adaptation to environmental conditions, diverse cultural meanings of menstruation, oral transmissions of knowledge through generations, community-based learning and guidance, integration of menstruation into broader ecological understanding. This global diversity shows that there has never been a single way humanity managed menstruation. Instead, there have always been many solutions, each shaped by environment, culture, and survival needs. From here, the narrative moves toward a deeper synthesis, how myths, taboos, and symbolic meanings evolved across civilizations, shaping attitudes that still influence perceptions of menstruation today. Hygiene materials across civilizations, cloth, plant, fibers, sponges, and early reusable systems. Across all ancient civilizations and indigenous societies, one reality remains consistent. Menstruation always required materials that could absorb, contain, and manage blood flow in the absence of modern sanitary products. While cultures differed greatly in beliefs, environments, and medical theories, the practical challenge was universal. How do you manage a natural monthly biological process with no manufactured pads, no tampons, and no industrial hygiene systems? The answer throughout human history is adaptation, using whatever the environment could provide, shaped by ingenuity, necessity, and experience passed through generations. In the earliest periods of human history, the most common menstrual materials were entirely natural and locally sourced. These included plant fibers, animal-derived materials, woven textiles, and absorbent natural substances. Each had strengths and limitations, depending on geography and climate. One of the most widespread developments across civilizations was the use of cloth-based systems. As weaving technology advanced in Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, Greece, and Rome, fabric became the foundation of menstrual management. Linen, cotton, silk, and wool were folded into layers and used as reusable absorbent pads. Cloth offered several advantages. It was soft against the skin, relatively easy to wash, and reusable over long periods. In civilizations with access to water and sunlight, such as Egypt and India, cloth-based systems were especially effective. Washing removed blood residues, while sun-drying helped reduce odor and improve cleanliness. In ancient Egypt, linen was particularly important due to its softness and breathability. In India, cotton became the dominant material due to its natural availability and comfort in warm climates. In China, silk and hemp were used depending on social status and regional resources. In Greece and Rome, linen and wool were more common, with wool sometimes used in colder regions for added warmth. Outside these major civilizations, indigenous communities developed an even wider range of natural materials. Plant-based absorbents such as moss, soft leaves, grass bundles, and tree bark fibers were widely used in forested environments. Moss was especially effective due to its natural moisture retention properties and softness. In colder northern regions, animal materials became essential. Fur and wool from hunted animals were used not only for clothing, but also for absorbent purposes. These materials provided insulation, which was important in harsh climates, where maintaining body warmth was a survival necessity. In some coastal and island societies, natural sea sponges were used as early internal absorbent materials. Sponges, when cleaned and prepared, could be inserted and later removed, making them one of the earliest known forms of internal menstrual management. While not universal, this practice demonstrates early experimentation with different forms of absorption technology. Water played a crucial role in all hygiene systems. Regardless of material type, washing was essential. Rivers, lakes, wells, and stored water sources were used to clean reusable materials. In many cultures, water was not only a physical cleansing agent, but also carried symbolic meanings of purification and renewal. Sunlight was another natural technology used across civilizations. Drying cloth and other materials in the sun helped reduce moisture, limit odor, and improve cleanliness. In hot and dry climates, this process was particularly effective and became a routine part of menstrual hygiene care. In addition to external absorbents, clothing itself often served a dual function. Many ancient garments were designed in layered or wrap-style forms, allowing them to be adjusted for comfort and protection during menstruation. Loose-fitting garments also helped reduce discomfort and allowed airflow, which was important in warm climates. Across time, menstrual management systems became increasingly refined within the limits of available technology. However, they remained fundamentally reusable and environmentally integrated. Nothing was disposable in the modern sense. Every material had to be cleaned, maintained, and reused repeatedly, sometimes for years. Hygiene practices were also shaped by social structure. In wealthier households, access to more cloth, cleaner water, and private washing areas made menstrual care easier and more comfortable. In poorer or rural communities, materials had to be carefully conserved, and washing routines were adapted to available resources. Despite differences in material quality, the core principle remained consistent across civilizations. Menstruation required absorbent protection, combined with regular cleaning. Medical understanding also influenced hygiene choices. In systems like Ayurveda and traditional Chinese medicine, menstrual flow was linked to internal balance, so maintaining cleanliness was seen as part of supporting bodily harmony. In In Greek and Roman thought, hygiene was associated with regulating bodily fluids and maintaining health equilibrium. However, beyond medical theories, practical experience was the most important teacher. Women learned through lived experience which materials were most comfortable, which were most reliable, and how frequently they needed to be changed or washed. Over generations, this knowledge became deeply embedded in cultural practices, passed from older women to younger girls as part of everyday life education. It was not formal science, but it was highly effective practical knowledge refined over thousands of years. It is also important to recognize that menstrual materials were not static. They evolved continuously as societies changed. The introduction of new textiles, improved weaving techniques, and expanded trade networks all influenced what materials were available and how they were used. For example, the spread of cotton cultivation dramatically improved menstrual comfort in many regions. Similarly, advances in textile dyeing and fabric processing improved cleanliness and durability. Even small innovations in weaving patterns could change how absorbent and comfortable a cloth became. In summary, across all civilizations and environments, ancient menstrual hygiene materials can be understood in several categories. Cloth-based systems: linen, cotton, silk, wool. Plant-based absorbents: moss, leaves, grass, bark fibers. Animal-derived materials: fur, wool, hides, natural sponges in some coastal regions, layered clothing and wrap garments. Water and sunlight as essential cleaning tools. This global diversity reveals a powerful truth. Human ingenuity consistently transformed available natural resources into functional hygiene systems long before modern technology existed. From here, the historical narrative moves from physical materials to something more complex and deeply cultural. Myths, taboos, and symbolic meanings surrounding menstruation, which shaped how societies emotionally and socially interpreted this natural process. Myths, taboos, and misconceptions. Blood, symbolism, and cultural meaning across civilizations. As human societies grew more complex, menstruation stopped being understood only as a biological rhythm or a practical hygiene challenge. It also became a powerful cultural symbol. Across different civilizations, menstrual blood began to carry layered meanings, sometimes linked to fertility and life, sometimes to danger, and sometimes to ritual rules about purity and separation. These meanings were not universal. They varied widely across geography, religion, and historical period. But one consistent pattern appears in the ancient world. When something biological was not fully understood scientifically, it often gained symbolic interpretation. Menstrual blood, being visible and cyclical, naturally attracted attention in early human thought systems. It was different from bleeding, caused by injury, because it appeared without external harm. This difference alone was enough to generate explanation systems that combined observation, spirituality, and cultural logic. In many ancient societies, menstruation was connected to ideas of life force and fertility. Blood itself was widely regarded as a carrier of vitality. Because menstruation is directly linked to reproduction, it was sometimes interpreted as evidence of the body's ability to create life. In such contexts, it could be seen as powerful, even sacred. At the same time, in other cultural settings, bodily fluids were associated with ritual boundaries, not because they were considered dirty in a modern sense, but because ancient societies often created symbolic distinctions between states of purity and transition. Menstruation, being a recurring transformation of the body, sometimes placed women in a temporary category of ritual separation. This is where taboos begin to emerge, not always as negative judgments, but as structured cultural rules about behavior during certain bodily states. In some communities, these rules involved rest, reduced physical labor, or temporary separation from specific religious spaces. In others, there were no restrictions at all beyond practical hygiene. It is important to understand that taboo in ancient contexts does not always mean fear or rejection. In anthropological terms, taboos are often systems of social organization. They define boundaries, protect sacred spaces, and structure community behavior. Menstruation became part of this broader symbolic system in many cultures. In ancient Greece, for example, bodily fluids were sometimes connected to ritual purity in temple practices, but menstruation was still medically understood as natural. In Rome, similar ideas existed alongside practical medical approaches. In ancient China, menstruation was linked to internal balance rather than moral impurity, though certain practices encouraged rest and reduced activity. In India, interpretations varied widely, depending on philosophical, regional, and ritual traditions, ranging from medical naturalism in Ayurveda to more symbolic restrictions in some cultural contexts. In indigenous cultures, interpretations were even more diverse. Some communities viewed menstruation as a time of strength, reflection, or connection to natural cycles. Others treated it as a private period, requiring rest or separation. Importantly, these practices were usually rooted in cultural meaning systems rather than universal judgments about cleanliness or value. Mythology also played a major role in shaping perceptions. Across civilizations, goddesses associated with fertility, creation, and lunar cycles were linked symbolically to menstruation. The moon itself became one of the most common symbols connected to menstrual timing due to the visible similarity between lunar cycles and human reproductive cycles. This lunar connection appears in many ancient traditions. The moon's phases, waxing, full, waning, and dark, were often interpreted as a mirror of cyclical change in nature and the human body. While not scientifically accurate in detail, this symbolic alignment helped early societies conceptualize time, fertility, and bodily rhythm in an organized way. However, alongside symbolic respect and natural interpretation, misconceptions also developed. In some ancient texts and folk beliefs, menstruation was attributed properties that we now know are scientifically incorrect. These included ideas that menstrual blood could affect crops, animals, or the environment in supernatural ways, or that it carried special powers unrelated to biology. Such beliefs often arose from attempts to explain observed coincidences without scientific frameworks. For example, if agricultural outcomes changed with seasons that also coincided with human reproductive cycles, symbolic connections might be formed. Over time, these associations became cultural narratives. It is also important to recognize that misconceptions were not unique to any one civilization. They appear in various forms across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. This reflects a universal stage of human intellectual development, where symbolic thinking often filled gaps in scientific understanding. At the same time, these beliefs coexisted with practical knowledge. Even in societies with strong mythological interpretations, women still used effective menstrual management techniques, understood timing of cycles, and maintained hygiene through proven methods like cloth use, washing, and rest. One of the most significant tensions in ancient menstrual understanding was therefore between symbolic interpretation and practical reality. On one side, menstruation was explained through myths, spiritual frameworks, and cultural rules. On the other side, it was managed through everyday experience, observation, and practical hygiene knowledge. These two systems were not always in conflict. In many cases, they coexisted and supported different aspects of life. One explaining meaning, the other managing function. Over time, however, as medical systems became more structured in later civilizations, particularly during classical and post-classical periods, practical biological understanding gradually became more dominant in formal medicine, even while cultural beliefs continued in social traditions. In summary, myths, taboos, and misconceptions surrounding menstruation across ancient civilizations can be understood through several key patterns. Menstruation as a symbol of fertility and life force, association with lunar cycles and natural rhythms, cultural rules of purity, rest, or separation. In some societies, mythological interpretations of feminine cycles and power misconceptions based on symbolic reasoning rather than biology. Coexistence of mythic belief systems and practical hygiene knowledge. This complex mixture of belief and experience shaped how menstruation was understood emotionally and socially for thousands of years. From here, the narrative moves towards how ancient women actually lived within these systems, how they worked, survived, and managed daily life while experiencing menstruation in societies that often demanded both productivity and adaptation. Survival, strength, and adaptation. Daily life, work, and resilience across ancient worlds. Across every civilization discussed so far, one truth remains constant. Menstruation did not pause human life. Women still worked, traveled, farmed, gathered resources, raised children, built communities, and contributed to survival systems while managing a monthly biological cycle. Ancient societies did not have modern sanitary products, pain relief systems, or workplace accommodations. Yet life continued with remarkable adaptability. The story of menstruation in ancient times is therefore not only about biology or culture, but about endurance, routine, and the practical intelligence of daily survival. In early agricultural societies such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China, women were deeply involved in labor-intensive work. This included farming, weaving, food preparation, water collection, and household management. Menstruation had to be managed within these responsibilities, not outside them. The most common adaptation across civilizations was flexibility of movement and activity. Women often adjusted physical effort during heavier flow days, reducing strenuous tasks when possible. This was not always a formal rule, but a practical response to discomfort, fatigue, and the need for hygiene maintenance. In civilizations with cloth-based menstrual systems, such as Egypt, India, China, Greece, and Rome, the ability to wash and reuse materials was essential. Women developed routines around water access, planning washing times, drying cloth in sunlight, and keeping spare materials available when possible. These routines became part of daily life organization. In indigenous and rural societies, adaptation was even more closely tied to environment. Women learned to use whatever natural materials were available at the moment: plants, moss, bark, animal fibers, and to replace them frequently when needed. This required deep ecological knowledge and constant awareness of surroundings. One of the most important aspects of adaptation was mobility. In nomadic or semi-nomadic societies, movement was constant. Menstruation did not stop travel, migration, or survival activities. Instead, women carried necessary materials with them and used natural resources along the way. Survival depended on flexibility, not fixed infrastructure. Emotional and psychological adaptation also played a role. While ancient medical systems did not use modern psychological language, many traditions recognized the importance of rest, reduced stress, and emotional balance during menstruation. Ayurveda emphasized calmness and dietary simplicity. Traditional Chinese medicine emphasized energy conservation and internal harmony. These ideas, though framed differently, all supported the idea of maintaining balance during cyclical bodily changes. Pain management in ancient times was limited, but not absent. Herbal remedies were widely used across civilizations. Ginger, fennel, cinnamon, peony, and various local plants were used to reduce cramps or regulate flow. Warm compresses, baths, and rest were also practical methods used across cultures to relieve discomfort. Despite these strategies, it is important to recognize that ancient life could be physically demanding. There were no standardized rest systems, labor protections, or medical interventions for menstrual-related difficulties. Women relied heavily on personal experience, family knowledge, and community support to manage their cycles. Community knowledge transmission played a critical role in survival. Older women often taught younger girls how to recognize their first menstrual cycle, how to use available materials, and how to maintain hygiene within their environment. This knowledge transfer was informal, but extremely important for continuity of survival practices. In many societies, menstruation was also integrated into life stages. The first menstrual cycle often marked a transition into adulthood or reproductive maturity. This transition sometimes came with new responsibilities, expectations, or social recognition. While interpretations varied widely across cultures, the biological event remained a shared marker of change. Work itself was often adapted rather than interrupted. In textile-producing societies, women could continue weaving or crafting while managing menstruation. In agricultural societies, lighter tasks could be performed during certain days. In household settings, duties were distributed or adjusted informally based on need. Privacy was another factor influencing adaptation. In densely populated urban environments, such as Mesopotamian cities or Roman settlements, privacy was limited. So women developed discreet methods of managing hygiene. In rural or natural environments, privacy was more available, allowing for easier washing and material changes. Environmental awareness was also central. Women needed to understand water sources, seasonal changes, and material availability. For example, in dry regions, water conservation was critical, while in wet or riverine environments, frequent washing was easier. In cold regions, warmth and insulation became equally important considerations alongside absorbency. Despite all these challenges, ancient women developed highly effective, sustainable systems of menstrual management that were fully integrated into everyday life. These systems were not separate from survival. They were part of survival itself. What emerges from all civilizations is a consistent pattern of resilience, adaptation of work schedules based on physical comfort, use of reusable, locally available materials, integration of hygiene routines into daily survival tasks, reliance on herbal and natural remedies for discomfort, strong intergenerational knowledge, transfer continuous participation in labor and community life. Menstruation in this context was not an interruption of life, but a recurring rhythm within it. It required management, but it did not define limitation. Instead, it became another factor that human societies learned to integrate into complex systems of survival. From here, the narrative moves towards the final transformation, how ancient practices gradually evolved into modern systems of menstrual hygiene, influenced by industrial change, scientific discovery, and global shifts in health understanding. As human societies move from the medieval and early modern periods into the era of industrialization, menstruation began to be managed in a very different context. The core biological process remained unchanged, but the tools, materials, medical understanding, and social structures surrounding it underwent major transformation. For thousands of years, menstrual management had relied on reusable natural materials, primarily cloth, plant fibers, animal-derived absorbents, and water-based cleaning systems. These methods were deeply integrated into daily life. But with the rise of cities, factories, global trade, and modern medicine, new possibilities began to emerge. One of the most important shifts was the development of improved textile production. The Industrial Revolution introduced mechanized weaving and mass production of cotton fabric. Cotton became cheaper, more widely available, and more standardized in quality. This made cloth-based menstrual management easier and more accessible than in many earlier historical periods. Even before disposable products existed, women in many parts of the world continued to use folded cloth as their primary menstrual material. However, the difference in this new era was that cloth itself became more uniform, softer, and easier to clean due to advances in soap production and washing techniques. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, major changes in hygiene science began to reshape how menstruation was understood. The rise of germ theory, showing that microorganisms cause disease, transformed public health thinking. Clean water systems, improved sanitation infrastructure, and better understanding of infection risk all influence menstrual hygiene practices. At the same time, social attitudes toward menstruation in many industrial societies became more private and less openly discussed. Unlike some ancient cultures, where menstruation had visible ritual or social roles, modern urban life often pushed it into the realm of personal privacy. This shift was influenced by broader cultural changes around modesty, gender roles, and medical professionalization. The first commercially produced disposable menstrual products began to appear in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Early versions of sanitary pads were made from cotton, wood pulp, or gauze-like materials. These were initially designed for use in hospitals or nursing settings, especially for postpartum care, before becoming more widely marketed for general menstrual use. Over time, industrial manufacturers refined these products. Adhesive technologies, improved absorbent materials, and standardized sizing made disposable pads more practical and convenient than reusable cloth in many contexts. This marked a major turning point in menstrual hygiene history. For the first time, single-use products became widely available in some parts of the world. Another significant development was the introduction of internal menstrual products such as tampons. These were designed to absorb menstrual flow internally using compressed cotton or similar materials. Their development reflected both advances in medical understanding and changing attitudes toward bodily autonomy, hygiene, and convenience. By the mid-20th century, disposable menstrual products had become widely commercialized in many countries. Advertising and marketing played a major role in shaping public perceptions of menstruation, often emphasizing cleanliness, convenience, and discretion. This contrasted with earlier historical periods where menstruation was managed more openly within household systems or community knowledge frameworks. However, even as industrial products spread globally, many traditional practices did not disappear. In large parts of the world, reusable cloth remains an important and practical solution due to cost, accessibility, environmental considerations, and cultural preference. This creates a global landscape where ancient and modern systems coexist. The late 20th and early 21st centuries introduced another major shift: the rise of menstrual health awareness and education. Public health organizations, medical research, and social movements began to focus more openly on menstrual hygiene management as a global health issue. This included efforts to improve access to safe menstrual products, reduce stigma, and provide education about reproductive health. In many regions, discussions about menstruation became more visible in schools, healthcare systems, and public policy for the first time in history. At the same time, environmental concerns have led to renewed interest in reusable and sustainable menstrual solutions. Cloth pads, menstrual cups, and other reusable systems have gained attention as alternatives to single-use products, echoing older historical practices, but with modern materials and design improvements. What is striking when looking at this long historical journey is that modern menstrual hygiene is not a complete break from the past. Instead, it is an evolution built on thousands of years of human adaptation. The core challenges, absorption, hygiene, comfort, and dignity, remain the same. Only the tools have changed. From ancient linen cloth in Egypt, cotton in India, silk in China, moss in forests, animal fibers in cold climates, and sponges in coastal regions. Humanity has always sought practical solutions using available resources. Industrialization simply standardized and mass-produced what had long existed in natural localized forms. Medical science also transformed understanding. Menstruation is now recognized as a normal physiological process, regulated by hormonal cycles, reproductive biology, and overall health status. This scientific framework replaced earlier symbolic, mythological, or purely observational explanations, while still coexisting with cultural meanings in many societies. Despite all advancements, the core human experience remains continuous across time. The physical process of menstruation has not changed. What has changed is how societies support, interpret, and manage it. In summary, the evolution toward modern menstrual sanitation includes industrial production of cotton and absorbent materials, development of disposable sanitary pads and tampons, advancements in hygiene, science and germ theory, increased privacy and social discretion around menstruation, expansion of global menstrual health, education, continued coexistence of traditional and modern methods, renewed interest in sustainable, reusable solutions. This chapter marks the transition from ancient survival-based systems to modern health infrastructure. But it also closes a loop. Many new solutions echo ancient practices in updated forms, showing that human innovation often returns to timeless practical principles. Across the entire timeline of human civilization, from prehistoric survival groups to industrial modern societies, menstruation remains one of the most consistent biological experiences in human history. It has never changed in function, but it has changed endlessly in meaning, interpretation, and management. When all earlier parts are viewed together, a clear pattern emerges. Every society had to solve the same fundamental challenges: absorption, hygiene, comfort, and continuity of daily life. Yet each civilization solved these challenges using different materials, shaped by environment, technology, belief systems, and social organization. In the earliest human societies, menstruation was managed through direct interaction with nature. Moss, leaves, grass, animal fur, and bark fibers were used because they were available and functional. There was no separation between human needs and the environment. Survival depended on immediate adaptation. As agriculture developed and civilizations formed, more structured systems emerged. Egypt introduced linen-based cloth systems supported by water access and sunlight. Mesopotamia combined woven textiles with ritual and early urban hygiene challenges. India integrated cotton cloth with Ayurvedic principles of balance and bodily rhythm. China interpreted menstruation through qi, yin-yang balance, and herbal medical systems. Greece and Rome developed humoral theory and early anatomical reasoning, alongside practical cloth-based management. In indigenous societies across Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific, diversity was the defining feature. Menstrual management was deeply tied to ecology. Plants, animal resources, and woven natural materials were adapted to specific environments. Knowledge was transmitted orally, embedded in daily life, rather than written systems. Across all these systems, one consistent truth remains: Menstruation was never separate from life. Women continued working, caring for families, producing goods, traveling, and participating in society while managing their cycles. There was no historical period where menstruation stopped human activity. Instead, humans built systems around it. The cultural meaning of menstruation, however, varied widely. In some societies, it was linked to fertility and life force. In others, it was associated with ritual rules, symbolic purity, or structured rest. In many traditions, it was connected to lunar cycles and natural rhythms. In others, it was interpreted through medical theories of bodily balance. Importantly, none of these interpretations existed in isolation. Practical knowledge always coexisted with symbolic meaning. A woman could follow ritual practices while still using cloth and water for hygiene. A physician could explain menstruation through humors or qi while still recommending rest, herbs, and dietary care. These systems overlapped rather than replaced each other. Over time, scientific medicine gradually redefined menstruation in biological terms. Hormones, reproductive anatomy, and endocrine cycles replaced earlier symbolic frameworks in formal medical systems. Yet cultural meanings did not disappear. They continued alongside scientific understanding, shaping personal and social experiences. Modern menstrual hygiene, with disposable pads, tampons, menstrual cups, and advanced healthcare systems, represents the latest stage in this long evolution. But it is not a separate story from the past. It is a continuation of the same human effort to solve a constant biological reality using the best available tools of each era. Even modern debates about sustainability, accessibility, and menstrual health equity echo ancient concerns in new form. Reusable cloth systems resemble ancient textile practices. Natural absorbents in traditional societies resemble earlier ecological solutions. Water and cleanliness remain central, just as they were in Egypt, India, and beyond. When viewed across 100,000 plus years of human development, menstruation is not a story of change in the body, but a story of change in understanding. It shows how humans consistently observed natural biological cycles, developed materials from their environment, built cultural meanings around bodily processes, integrated health knowledge into daily survival, evolved systems as technology advanced, balanced symbolism with practical necessity. In the end, the history of menstruation is also the history of human adaptation itself. It reflects how societies interpret the same natural phenomenon through different lenses: survival, religion, medicine, philosophy, and science, without ever altering the underlying reality of the human body. And across every era, one truth remains constant. Menstruation has always been part of life, and human civilization has always found a way to live with it, understand it, and adapt to it. This completes the full narrative journey from ancient origins to modern understanding. A continuous human story, written not in a single culture or time, but across all of humanity. When the entire long history of menstruation is placed under one lens, from prehistoric survival societies to modern medical systems, something important becomes clear. There has never been a single, linear truth about menstruation in human culture. Instead, there have always been overlapping layers of understanding: practical, symbolic, medical, religious, and social, often existing at the same time, sometimes supporting each other, and sometimes contradicting each other. This final synthesis is not about adding new civilizations or new materials. It is about pulling together everything that has already been explored and showing how human understanding of menstruation has always been shaped by context rather than universal agreement. One of the most consistent contradictions throughout history is between biology and interpretation. The biological process of menstruation is universal across human populations. It follows hormonal cycles, reproductive physiology, and natural fertility patterns. This has never changed. But the meaning attached to it has changed constantly. In early human societies, menstruation was simply experienced as part of life. There was no formal system of explanation. Practical survival dictated behavior. Find absorbent materials, maintain hygiene, and continue daily tasks. As societies became more structured, interpretation expanded. Egypt linked menstruation to medical balance and river symbolism. Mesopotamia added early urban ritual frameworks and supernatural explanations alongside practical cloth systems. India developed a dual system of Ayurveda and cultural ritual interpretations. China created a structured theory of qi and yin-yang balance. Greece and Rome introduced anatomical reasoning and humoral theory. These systems were not wrong in the sense of intention. They were attempts to explain a complex biological reality using the intellectual tools available at the time. But they were incomplete, and often symbolic rather than physiological. Another major contradiction appears in the concept of purity and taboo. In some cultures, menstruation was treated as sacred or powerful. In others, it was associated with temporary separation or ritual restriction. In still others, it was simply a private bodily function with no special social rules beyond hygiene. Even within a single civilization, multiple interpretations often coexisted. A medical text might describe menstruation as natural bodily regulation, while religious practice might impose temporary restrictions, and folk belief might add symbolic meanings. This layered structure shows that ancient societies did not have one unified belief about menstruation. Instead, they had multiple parallel belief systems operating at the same time. Another contradiction lies between visibility and invisibility. In some historical contexts, menstruation was openly integrated into life cycles and knowledge transmission between women. In others, it became increasingly private, especially in later urbanized and industrial societies. This shift was not linear either. Privacy increased in some eras due to urbanization and changing social norms, but communal knowledge sharing remained strong in many rural and indigenous contexts. Across all periods, however, one fact remains consistent. Women always developed functional systems for managing menstruation, regardless of cultural meaning. Whether through moss in forest, linen in Egypt, cotton in India, silk in China, wool in Europe, or cloth in modern societies, the practical solution always existed alongside belief systems. This is perhaps the most important reality of the entire historical narrative. survival always came before symbolism. Even when myths described menstrual blood as powerful, dangerous, or sacred, daily life required practical hygiene. Even when medical theories described humors, chi, or bodily fluids, women still needed absorbent materials and cleaning methods. Even when religious systems defined rituals or restrictions, biological necessity continued unchanged. Another key contradiction is the gap between elite knowledge and lived experience. Many historical records come from medical scholars, religious texts, or philosophical writings, mostly written by educated elites. But everyday menstrual management was practiced by ordinary women, whose knowledge was rarely written down. This means much of real menstrual history is reconstructed indirectly, through archaeology, anthropology, and comparative cultural analysis. The lived reality was likely far more practical, flexible, and adaptive than many formal texts suggest. Despite these contradictions, there is also a deep continuity running through all eras. That continuity is human adaptation. Across every environment and time period, humans consistently observed menstrual cycles, created absorbent materials from available resources, developed cleaning and reuse systems, transmitted knowledge between generations, adapted to climate, geography, and social structure, continued daily life without interruption. This continuity shows that menstruation has never been a barrier to human survival or progress. Instead, it has been a constant biological rhythm integrated into every stage of civilization. When myths are stripped away and practical reality is examined, menstruation becomes less about mystery and more about adaptation. Not something separate from human history, but something deeply embedded within it. The final synthesis of this entire historical journey can be stated simply. Menstruation has always been biologically the same process, but culturally, it has been everything humans imagined it to be: sacred, medical, symbolic, private, natural, regulated, or misunderstood. And through all interpretations, one constant remains unbroken. Human beings always found a way to live with it, manage it, and continue life around it. This is the final structural truth of the historical narrative. Not a conclusion of the body, but a conclusion of interpretation itself. The story does not end here because the biology has ended. It ends here because the history of interpretation has reached its full cycle, from survival to symbolism to science and into modern awareness. After tracing menstruation through prehistoric survival, ancient civilizations, classical medical systems, indigenous knowledge, mythological interpretations, and modern scientific understanding, the full picture becomes clear. Menstruation is one of the most continuous and unchanged biological processes in human history, while simultaneously being one of the most differently interpreted. This final conclusion is not a separate ending. It is the point where all earlier parts merge into a single, continuous human story. Across all eras, one foundational reality never changed. Menstruation is a biological function linked to reproduction, governed by hormonal cycles, and shared by humans across geography, culture, and time. No civilization altered this fact. What changed was how humans explained it, responded to it, and integrated it into daily life. In the earliest human societies, menstruation was simply managed as part of survival. There was no separation between body and environment. Natural materials such as moss, leaves, animal fur, and bark were used because they were available. Life continued without interruption because survival required constant adaptation. As civilizations formed, interpretation expanded. Egypt integrated hygiene with early medical thought and symbolic connection to nature. Mesopotamia combined urban life with ritual explanations and early written medical systems. India developed Ayurveda, linking menstruation to bodily balance and natural cycles. China explained it through qi, yin-yang, and systemic harmony. Greece and Rome introduced anatomical reasoning and humoral theory, shaping Western medical foundations for centuries. Indigenous cultures across the world demonstrated the widest diversity of adaptation, shaped entirely by environment and ecological knowledge. Forests, deserts, mountains, islands, and tundra all produced different menstrual solutions, yet all shared the same core principle: use what nature provides and integrate it into life. Across all these systems, a consistent truth emerges. Menstruation was never separate from human survival. Women did not pause life because of it. They adapted around it, worked through it, and integrated it into daily existence, using knowledge passed through generations. The rise of industrial society introduced new tools: mass-produced cloth, disposable pads, tampons, and modern medical science. These innovations changed the material experience of menstruation, but did not change the biological reality. They improved convenience, hygiene, and accessibility in many parts of the world, while also introducing new global inequalities in access and awareness. At the same time, modern science replaced symbolic and mythological explanations with hormonal biology, reproductive endocrinology, and clinical understanding. Menstruation became fully explained in physiological terms. Yet cultural meanings did not disappear. They continued alongside science, shaping personal identity, social norms, and lived experience. Looking across the full timeline, one of the most important insights is that menstruation has always existed at the intersection of three forces: biology, the unchanging physical process; environment shaping materials and survival methods; culture shaping meaning, belief, and interpretation. When these three forces combine differently across time and geography, the result is the enormous diversity of menstrual history. Another key realization is that progress in menstrual management has never been purely linear. Ancient cloth systems were highly effective and sustainable. Indigenous ecological methods were deeply adapted to environment. Modern disposable systems offer convenience, but introduce environmental and economic challenges. Today's world is not simply better or worse than the past. It is different, with trade-offs shaped by technology and society. What remains constant is human adaptability. Every civilization, regardless of complexity or resources, developed systems that allowed life to continue normally. Menstruation never stopped human progress. Instead, humans continuously developed ways to live alongside it. there is also a deeper philosophical continuity. Menstruation reflects cycles of biology, nature, time, and life itself. Ancient cultures often recognize this through lunar symbolism, seasonal comparisons, and fertility associations. Modern science describes it through hormones and physiology. Both perspectives, though different in language, point towards the same underlying rhythm, the cyclical nature of life. In the end, the history of menstruation is not just a medical history. It is a human history. It reflects how societies think about the body, how they use natural resources, how they build knowledge, and how they pass experience across generations. From moss and cloth to modern hygiene products, from myth and ritual to biology and medicine, the journey is continuous. Not a series of disconnected eras, but one evolving story of human adaptation. The final truth is simple. Menstruation has always been part of human life. Human civilization has always adapted to it. And every era has added its own layer of understanding without erasing what came before. This completes the full narrative cycle, from origin to modern understanding, from survival to science, from myth to explanation, forming a continuous human story that spans all known history.